Hello, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Raymond Nicolet Trust Podcast. My name is Gavrilo Nikolic, and every month I bring you inspiring conversations about the future of education, science, and philanthropy from world top academics, scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and philanthropists. My guest today is Professor Vesna Goldsworthy. Vesna is a novelist, memoirist, and poet with many years' experience in teaching creative writing and English literature. She came to academia after a career at the BBC, and she continues to produce and present radio programs. Vesna is the first Serbian Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in London. Her first novel, Gorski, in 2015, was the New York Times Editor's Choice and More Stone's Book of the Month, as well as being longlisted for the Bailey's Prize and serialized as Book at Bedtime on BBC Radio 4. It has been translated into 15 languages, and her second book, published in 2018, Monsignor K, has or was one of the Times Summer Reads choice of best new novels. Her internationally best-selling memoir, Chernobyl Strawberries, in 2005, was serialized in the Times and read by Goldsworthy herself as Book of the Week on Radio 4. The Crash Show prize-winning poetry collection, The Angel of Salonika, published in 2011, was one of the Times best poetry books of the year, described by G.M. Coetzee as a welcome new voice in British poetry. Vesna Goldsworthy's new novel, Iron Curtain, published in 2022 in UK and will be published in 2023 in the US, is one of the Times best books of 2022. And definitely one of the best sellers on Amazon Kindle, my favorite way of reading, by the way. If you're curious to learn more about Vesna and her work, you need to listen to this episode. Just a moment, the one and only Professor Vesna Goldsworthy. Vesna, welcome to the RNT podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
You made my life a bit difficult with a lot of stuff you are working on and you have published, but hopefully we managed to focus on the most important one in the introduction. So thank you very much for that. Before we focus on your life story, on what you're currently doing, and on some of the books that are in the background, in your background to this call, let's start with basics. Where are you currently and what are you doing as we speak?
I am in London. I'm sitting in my study. It's a very, very sunny day outside. I think it's terribly hot in most of Europe, but here it's very pleasant. It is my birthday today, so I decided not to work. After this podcast, I will be doing an interview with a Romanian radio station. My books are very popular in Romania, so I do get a lot of those interviews. But after that, I will be going out and walking along the Thames and meeting some friends for lunch. So it will be a long weekend.
First of all, happy birthday. It's something I was
Thank
not
you.
aware of, but it's great. So we did not have recordings on the day of somebody's birthday for 15 episodes we have published so far on RNT podcast. It's great to have that milestone achieved as well. Before we switch to discussing, for starters, a bit about radio, why are your books so popular in Romania? So it's not something the one here every day.
It's a Books have different destinies in different countries. And so, for example, my memoir, Chernobyl Strawberries, had 14 different editions in Germany, did terribly well. The novels, perhaps not so well. In Romania, what actually happened was that Monsieur K, which is a story of Anna Karenina's grandson, absolutely exploded. And so while the earlier books were known, since that last book, when it was on bestseller lists, I became a bit of a fiction star, I guess. You can't control those things, and you don't know. If you knew what is a recipe for a bestseller, you'd do it every time.
Exactly. I pretty much agree with you based on some books or some authors I follow closely in the fiction world. So one of those books can really explode, be a hit, and then the second one can backfire and pretty much
But
question the
I'm
author's
very
career.
lucky. Sorry, I jumped in. I'm very lucky, and writers are generally lucky when their books get translated into many languages. I have probably about 15 different languages in many different territories. So it's a bit like a lottery. You increase your chances.
Exactly. The more you do it, the better you get at it. But there are still risks that need to be mitigated along the way. Vesna, let us focus a bit on your radio career. How did you start your career at radio and specifically at BBC?
As with probably other questions that you will ask, there are always two answers. One answer relates to Serbia, where I lived until I was 24, and one answer relates to the UK, where I always have a new beginning because essentially I had to start afresh. So in Serbia, I was a presenter of a program that's called Prekobrojni čas, an extra hour for school children. It was lovely on Studio B. And so I actually trained to be a radio presenter, if you want, when I was 17 or 18. When I came to England, that wasn't a career that I even dreamt of. I just didn't, my English wasn't good enough, etc. What I did is I worked in publishing, and then eventually, I think it was about 1989, 1990, I started following those ads for the BBC Serbian service. And in those days, what you did is you had very, very hard translation tests. And I remember doing those tests. So you were translating from English into Serbian, having huge problems with tennis because I didn't know any. This is not where my English was a problem. It was my Serbian. I didn't know what those expressions were in Serbian. And I passed the test. I became a presenter in the Serbian service of the BBC. But then I had various attachments to the newsroom, etc. And this is where my so-called BBC career both took off and disappointed at the same time. It took off because I was doing really exciting things, but it disappointed because that was the time of the war in former Yugoslavia. And I joined the BBC hoping to become some kind of culture journalist. And there I was covering the war, and I really am not a political person. So over the years, I enjoyed it less and less. It's really the war and its trauma meant that that career wasn't as enjoyable as I was hoping for, but I remember the BBC very fondly.
I can definitely concur what you have said about knowing words in other languages in your mother tongue, which only people that live abroad can understand, because you adopt then those words as the words that you associate certain items with, but you don't know the words in your mother tongue because you never used it before. We're kind of, jumping tracks, if I could call it that way. My next question was definitely in the direction what prompted you to change your career and to let's say, start the new academic one. But maybe moving forward with your activities and the change of profession in your life, how do you teach creative writing? You're, as we mentioned, professor of creative writing and English literature. What is actually creative writing in its essence, and how do one actually teaches creative writing? Because that word creative in the minds of a lot of people means like you need to get creative first before you put the words on the pen, or pen in your, let's say, in the ideal world, pen in your hand and then start writing some stuff or putting some stuff on the paper.
It's a fabulous question, but I will step back and answer several of the elements there. So first of all, you were talking about people who learn their languages abroad and live abroad and work in them. And what actually happens is that rather than becoming properly bilingual, it is almost like some archaeological layering. So I always talk about the words for my car. All the outside parts I know in Serbian, but once I lift the hub, it's only English that exists in my mind. We become imperfectly bilingual. What that means, and I'm going to your creative writing question, is that whichever language you choose to write in, you feel somehow vulnerable. So that when I first started writing, I started writing literary criticism in English. My first book, Inventing Ruritania, somewhere behind me, was published by Yale University Press in 1998, and that is a cultural study. At that stage, I wouldn't have thought of becoming a creative writer. If someone told me you write a novel one day, I wouldn't have believed. So what happened at the BBC, in addition to what I said before, was that I thought that if I moved to university, I'd have more time to write. This is an illusion to end all illusions, because instead of those very short deadlines that you have as a journalist where your stress explodes, but then you go home and the day's over, academia has these medium-term and long-term deadlines that are very toxic. You never have the time for yourself properly. So anyway, I moved. I taught English literature, as with Inventing Ruritania. And then what happened in 2003, and that changed my life, is that I had cancer. And I was diagnosed, it was diagnosed relatively late, and the prognosis didn't sound so good. So I decided to write a memoir. This is what became Chernobyl Strawberries. And as you can see, because we are now talking about 20 years on, the prognosis was wrong, luckily enough. But I discovered that my English was good enough, that I write well enough, and that I could be successful. Chernobyl Strawberries had 14 editions in Germany. It probably sold about 200,000, 250,000 copies when you add it up in different languages. So I found the freedom to be a writer. So that answers your question. What happened within the university is that that was also a time when creative writing was beginning to flourish as a discipline. So I gradually moved from teaching English literature into teaching creative writing.
That's a great segue into what we'll be discussing next. But what I definitely want to let's say send huge kudos to you is finding the strength to, when you're not feeling that well, to continue to focus on other stuff. And you are not the only example, but there are thousands of examples out there as we speak. When they feel bad, when they focus on other things, they produce better results, and they manage to also be successful in life challenges, and also in what they focused in that moment that brought them that strength.
Gavrilo, that's a fantastic thing to say. And I normally don't like it when people say, did cancer teach you anything? Because it didn't. It was a moment of great suffering for me. But what happened with writing is that I discovered, I didn't think about it as I was writing. I discovered that it was a way to take me out of myself. And I think that is in some ways healing. You find something that you do with such concentration that illness kind of goes away, doesn't occupy your mind. And that was so I would find, I was actually sitting where I was sitting now, and I remember that, laughing at the keyboard. How many people thinking that they are about to die find themselves laughing? And laughing was remembering various silly episodes from my life in Yugoslavia. I have to say, although writing a cancer memoir sounds depressing, the book is anything but. It's actually very funny because I was deliberately looking for, and it's also not bigging myself. It's not, my life is quite ordinary. I wasn't writing about some great things that happened. I'm not a general or a politician. So it's like those little things, remembering my first boyfriend and when he left me and why he left me. He wanted to have a New Year's Eve celebration with another girl, etc., etc. And that was suddenly very, very funny. So anyway, so there was I, and that is the essence of your question. Find something that will preoccupy you so deeply that you don't think about anything else, and then you'll do well.
Exactly. You just need to shift the mindset. There is a saying in Germany, or in German, let's put it that way, because it's essentially in the German language. I'm probably going to butcher it when translating to other languages, but it is actually saying that uh, let's say the most meaningful thing you can do in life is to learn how to dance in the rain, because we can all dance when there is no rain, but if you can learn to dance when there is rain, there is nothing that can surprise you. Let's put it that way.
That's a very nice one. I will remember that.
Vesna, let's go ahead. So obviously, not only that you survived, but you also started producing extensively your creative work. Before we focus on other novels that you worked on, let's just get back to that creative writing. How does that look like? So obviously, lay persons like myself, imagine you go into classroom, just give away paper on in those days or today, just give away some iPads or let's say laptops, and people then just start writing because for 1 hour they need to write 300 words, which is obviously the most silly imagination that one can have when he or she imagines how creative writing works or how the one teaches creative writing. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that before we dwell into other stuff you worked on in the meantime?
Yes, well, most people think that. Other people say, can you even teach creative writing? What's the point of that discipline? And so I'm used to responding. You can teach creative writing. If there is no basic talent for it, talent for words, you can only improve so much. And what we focus on is the form. So it is actually people come with their own ideas, their own stories, but the way you shape them is crucial. And what the class originally, when I started teaching, I kind of thought, because I moved from English literature, that I would just make people read certain things and look at them as writers, how these things put together. Keep your point of view, narrator, tenses, etc. But later on, I also did a bit of what you describe, which is to give people prompts to write, and then they would write things and come back and read and shape them. The emphasis is that I can't give you a storyline. I can improve a storyline that you already have. But what I've learned to be excellent at, and I supervised some prize-winning novels in my time, is to improve the shape of that story. So just to give you a tiny example, where I learned on my own practice is that if you're writing a life story, I started my memoir with the story of my birth. I was born in, as you would conventionally. And that didn't work because I couldn't tell that story in first person. I don't remember my own birth. It was secondhand. So I then started halfway, meaning I started in 1986 when I came to live in England and told the story in flashback, the Yugoslav story. So in some ways, shaping a memoir is the same as shaping a novel. You're not inventing, but the way you're putting things together is what you learn to do well. And I'm passing on that knowledge to my students. I also trained myself by reading other writers. I studied comparative literature. So it's the form that you teach. If I teach poetry, it's easier to understand the shape of the sonnet, the shape of the villanelle, how many lines can you have for a particular form. Those are the kinds of things that we train. So in some ways, it's closer to being making furniture than to some kind of work of genius, right? For a table to be balanced, it has to have legs of equal length. This is what my classes are about.
Fully agree with you. So in the end, if I can paraphrase it, it's pretty much like framing the loose cannon. So writers can be loose cannons, but you need to put them in the shape, pretty much like with the furniture. You need to put a leg on the table, but in what shape the legs are and what shape the table is, it depends really on the writer. In that sense, bearing in mind that you also have experience writing nonfiction, what attracts you personally more to fiction than to nonfiction? The reason why I'm asking is simply because I know a lot of people who are either reading new only nonfiction or only fiction. I'm pretty much maybe one of the rare people who kind of read both at the same time. So the way I do it, I have like two books always on my Kindle, actively reading. So switching between fiction and nonfiction. Prefer to read obviously nonfiction during the day and then fiction to like put me to sleep in the evening. But I'm curious to learn how do you differentiate between these two and what do you like to read in the end of the day?
It's a great question. How do you differentiate between the two? Now you have this absolute fashion for what is called autobiographic fiction, where the differentiation is absolutely impossible. So you have novels that are published as novels, but in fact they're memoirs, and vice versa. And since I mentioned Chernobyl Strawberries, my memoir, it was published as a memoir in the UK, but in Germany, where it was very successful, it was published, had a different title. It was called Heimweh nach Nirgendwo, and it was published as a novel. So if you went into a bookshop, you'd have to find it in a different place. So perhaps one very short answer to your question is it doesn't matter whether something is fiction or nonfiction, and sometimes it's impossible to tell. But as a writer, I found it very different, because if you describe your life, if you're writing somebody else's biography, which is what I did in Inventing Ruritania, you can't change the endings, right? So I mentioned that naughty boyfriend moments ago when I was joking about writing my memoir. I can't have a revenge moment and kind of kill him off in the novel. I can, and so it is ultimately that kind of freedom that appealed to me. So once I've learned how to control the form, I wanted to make up my own stories, right? And it's a kind of particular things that interested me with my novels is the life of London, the life of Slavonic settlers in London, and I could only explore that in a fictional form. Nonfiction would work outwards. What did these people do? But fiction gives you an opportunity to go inside their heads, to create conversations, to convey their thoughts, which is what I couldn't do in a biography. So it's yeah, I mean, I like them both. I'm not going to say that I'm a fiction or a non-fiction writer. The opportunities, the elasticity is very different.
It's a sort of writer's resiliency to take into account all the factors together. You mentioned that academic life is everything but not stressful as you imagined it. Now getting back to your own writing, which you do probably in your spare time, if you could call it that way, how do you combine it? I'm interested to learn more how, on the top of all the midterm, long-term deadlines, students, a lot of consultation hours, a lot of hours before a laptop, you still have strength, if I could call it that way, to write in the evening, in the morning, or over weekends.
And not to mention family life, the fact that one thing I need to do today is cook lunch and cook dinner. And, so, life is very practical too. How does one combine? It's a difficult question. I envy my full-time writer friends because while I publish one book, they publish 3 or sometimes 4. But at the same time, I have certain financial security that the writer friends don't. So these are the differences. There's no ideal in life. But so I write slowly. I have to combine a lot of these different things. The secret is to find the project, and I tell that to my students because a lot of them then have to work, that catches fire. So I have to really want to write a book so desperately that rather than watch box sets in the evening, I want to come back to my study and write that story. Or rather than go and have drinks with friends by the river, I want to come back to my study and write that story. It has to be a bloody good story. So I'm not driven by ambition to write another book. I'm driven by a sense of fun. It has to be something that I want to do myself, yeah? Like that story with Nobel Strawberries, to laugh at the keyboard. So that writing is more inspiring for me than anything else I could do at that time, yeah?
That's a wonderful, I would say, summary of what we have been talking about for the past 20 minutes, in the sense that you need to be guided by intrinsic motives. So obviously, in the end of the day, if somebody tells you, I will give you $1 million or £1 million for you to write a book, it would motivate you, but only short term. Long term, you need to have in mind how the book will finish and whether or not you're going to build up from that book. Obviously, speaking about that, not taking into account most of your books are not as a continuation of a series of novels written by you, but rather continuation of other books that have been written over time. Vesna, speaking about writing, speaking about the teaching of creative writing, what are some of the latest trends that you have spotted in this world when it comes to creative writing and fiction? Have you spotted maybe something that you would like to share with our audience?
What is actually very interesting is precisely the trend that I mentioned for autobiographic fiction, the blurring of genres, the hybrid genres, so that, for example, one of my new programs at the university where I teach is called nonfiction novel. And 10 or 15 years ago, people would even have thought, what is nonfiction novel? Now it seems that everything is possible. It is a novel that uses novelistic methods, but based on a true story. Truman Capote pioneered that kind of thing. So that's a new fashion. Another fashion that I notice from my students, much more than from me, is these novels that are creative or tiny little fragments, so that when you look at the book, you open the book and you can't even tell that it is a novel, because it looks like a series of paragraphs with blank spaces in between, but it's more like a mosaic. So these different ways of putting the story together are experimenting with that, are a great trend at the moment. And similarly, the blurring of poetry and fiction, the blurring of fiction and criticism. Maggie Nelson in the US started perhaps a fashion for that kind of trend, where you read and you don't know whether it's criticism or her own biography. I rather like that. It's a kind of free-for-all, but a disciplined free-for-all.
Fully agree with you. I see that on the example of some of the books I'm reading. It is becoming more difficult, I would say, to read, because the way, especially nonfiction books are structured, is that there are no structures, but rather like a collection of thoughts. So you really need to carefully read it in order to understand the entire book. Otherwise, you're kind of going to get lost in the middle and to forget what you read for the first 200 pages. If these are long books, if shorter, obviously,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
after 20 or 30 pages. Vesna, where do you see yourself over the next 10 years? Or let's put it in another way, in 10 years' time. Do you see yourself as a full-time writer by then, or still teaching in the university?
I halfway through this period of 10 years, I'm probably going to retire if all's well. I never take my health for granted, but if I retire in 5 years' time, then probably I would like to see maybe another 3 or 4 novels in this period. I don't want to get ambitious, but steady as you go, one every 2 or 3 years. I would like to travel more. What happens when you are an academic is that you are bound by seasonality. You can only travel in summer when everybody else does. So I would love to have some spring travel and some autumn travel in places where it's too hot in summer. Yeah. You see, now I'm talking about what I would like rather than where I see myself. But I guess that's the same at the moment. So travel more, out of season, a few more books, retiring, moving out of this study, maybe writing under some lovely tree somewhere by the sea. How does that
That
sound?
that sounds great, and it's a great wish list. So hopefully, in 10 years' time, when we repeat a conversation like that, we will be having conversation with some palm trees behind you and not books. Not that I have anything
Lovely.
against books, on the other, on the contrary. So I just wish that you have a nicer background and a more inspiring background, even more inspiring background to write from. Um, Vesna, before we close, I tend to ask our guests one very interesting question, and that is, what is the single most important thing that you love in your job?
It will be a great contradiction to a lot of things that I've just said, but I would say freedom. And it is very, very important to me. Freedom to write exactly what I want to write. I never write to order or to commission. Freedom to write when I want to. So whether it is very late at night or whether I decide to take a day off, academic work is very time consuming, but mainly if it is the way I do it, which is to do with workshops and teaching doctoral students, it's quite flexible. So I'm actually very pleased that for much of my life I had that freedom. I didn't have to be somewhere at 9 o'clock and leave somewhere at 6, etc. It's, yeah, freedom.
Any last words, anything else you would like to mention that we did not touch base on?
We spoke about so many different things. I don't have any last words other than perhaps bearing in mind your charity and its aims, to underline how wonderful education is when it leads to freedom of the kind that I described. So the more you learn, the more you study, the closer to a kind of freedom you can get.
Thank you very much for your kind last words. Thank you very much for taking time and for being my guest in RNT podcast.
Thank you.